So what did you check out this month?
Obviously, we've both seen the Star Wars movies a billion times.
Hmm.
But it had been a long time since I had watched Return of the Jedi, and I used to say it was my favorite Star Wars movie.
Really?
Yes, but it's definitely not as good
I know
as...
you like those Ewoks.
Yeah, well, obviously I hate the fucking Ewoks, but it was definitely not as good as the first two. Watching it with a slightly fresher perspective, probably the freshest perspective in a while, because this had been the longest period since I had watched it. There was some bad acting in that movie from freaking Harrison Ford and Billy D. Williams. I don't think it's entirely their fault. I think some of their dialogue is not good, but there's some weird acting. I mean, I don't think Billy D. Williams is a great actor to begin with. He pretty much just plays himself all the time.
As a kid, I had a Star Wars visual dictionary, and it had a picture of him, and it had things labeled, like it pointed to his cape, and it pointed to his boots, and, gave some descriptions, and it pointed to his face, and it labeled it as winning smile.
The Jabba stuff at the beginning, well, I mean, that makes up like a third of the movie, or maybe even more. I was surprised at how much of a horror tone they went to at times. It feels very almost inescapable for everybody for a while there, and there's a lot of cool stuff with all the weird creatures and all that stuff. I think maybe the fact that I've mostly seen it on VHS in widescreen, but in low resolution, kind of took away more from it than I would have thought. And I watched it this time on Disney Plus, so it was the, super extreme specialized edition. So, of course, there's a lot of stupid crap in it.
Ugh.
Yeah. But, yeah, I thought the Jabba stuff was... I mean, there's a lot of goofy humor in that movie that I think is a little too much, especially with the droids. But I really liked that first section way more than kind of the middle section, because I think the stuff at the end is really good with Luke and Vader and all that stuff. But the stuff in the middle, in between, even with like the speeder bike chase is cool, but everything's it feels kind of clumsy. It feels like they're all just kind of wandering around for a while and kind of loses a little bit of its momentum. The reason it was always my favorite one before was the stuff at the very end with Luke on the Death Star and all the space stuff, which is still awesome. And I just think about how cool so many of those shots are of just spaceships flying around, not even in the battle, just with the spaceships flying around. And then you compare that to scenes from the new Star Wars movies where it's all just a bunch of CGI ships moving around, where nothing feels like it's thought out in terms of framing or movement or anything. It's just, we gotta have ships flying through and blowing stuff up.
My favorite spaceship shot from any Star Wars movie is when the Falcon is going inside the second Death Star, and there's all that incredibly awesome camera work. It's just so cool.
I agree. And the fact that the shot starts out on the surface and goes inside, like I've never looked into how they did that shot, but it's pretty incredible.
Unbelievable.
Given the way everything has gone in the film industry and everything, I don't think we're ever going to get something that cool again in that way.
No.
Which is very depressing.
Extremely depressing.
But yeah, it's still a really good movie. Not as good as the first two.
Agreed. I really like the Emperor in that one. How he's pretty much a new character introduced at the end.
Yeah, and it works, even with that.
Right, it works really well. As a kid, he was always one of my favorite characters. Because, as a kid, you liked the big bad guy.
Yeah, I always wanted to be the Emperor when I grew up, so I started walking hunched over all the time. And
I cackle regularly. Oh, sorry, I mean...
I watched a movie called Eden Lake, which was from 2008, one of Michael Fassbender's earliest movies.
Like how early is early?
His first movie was 300, which came out a year earlier. In this movie, he played a guy who takes his girlfriend to a lake just to hang out for a weekend, and it turns out there's this gang of hoodlums that are hanging around there. And just to be clear, these kids are ranging from maybe middle school through late high school, and they keep getting in altercations with them that over the course of the movie escalate to the point that they're all trying to kill each other. It was the director's first movie, and it very much felt like it. It felt like the kind of thing where he had an idea for a story, and then once he started actually writing it out as a full script, realized he didn't quite have enough. So he had to kind of drag things out and make things artificially extend over the length of a full movie. So there are so many times when these characters could get out of their situation, but they'll decide to drop their weapons and start running, or they'll seemingly escape, but then they'll run into the bad guys again for just purely coincidental reasons. And that happens so many times over the course of the movie. By the time it was done, at the very end, there's a big thing where it's supposed to be shocking I'm not going to spoil it in case anybody watches it, but there's a moment that's supposed to be shocking where one of the characters gets to a location that turns out to be related to the bad guy characters. And by that point, I just groaned. I threw my hands up and said, "Come on." Because that had already happened so many times over the course of the movie, but now that it's at the very end, it's supposed to be very shocking, and it wasn't. It just felt stupid. It gets surprisingly intense at times. There are some specific scenes in the movie that are really effective, and the movie really, really makes you hate these kids and want to see, not just want to see them all get killed, but you want to do it yourself because these kids are absolute pieces of crap. But these main characters, part of the reason the movie keeps going is because they keep making stupid decisions that make you hate them. And there are times when the movie will try to kind of artificially build suspense or do it in a way that doesn't really make sense, where the characters will be around a turn, let's say, and the bad guys are about to come around the corner and see them. But when they round the corner, all of a sudden the main characters are not there, and you're kind of saying, oh, how did they get away? And then when you find out how they got away, it doesn't make sense because they didn't have time. They couldn't have done it without making noise. It would have worked a lot better if we had actually seen how they did it. And that happened multiple times in the movie, and it just got to the point where I was just frustrated by the end. So it honestly wasn't bad. It had a lot of potential, but it felt like it shouldn't have been a full-length movie. If it had been a short film, I feel like it could have been a lot better. So I couldn't really recommend it, but I could definitely see some people liking it. I watched Day of the Dead, the third George Romero zombie movie, and the last one as far as I'm concerned.
You're just against John Leguizamo.
I've always liked this movie, but it was always disappointing to me compared to the first two, especially given that Dawn of the Dead goes to such a huge scale, where you kind of get a perspective of what's happening across the entire country. And then Day of the Dead cuts things back to seemingly the last survivors, which is a relatively small group, and almost the entire movie is set underground. So that was always disappointing to me, but watching it now, taking it a bit more on its own and not looking at it compared to the first two, it was really good. The characters feel really well developed. They're all interesting. Well, some of the bad guys are very stereotypical, but the main characters are all interesting. They all have very distinct personalities. You actually care about what's happening to them. And the story is interesting, and the way it plays out is really effective. And I noticed, for the first time, the Ted Danson zombie from Creepshow. I knew he had a cameo in it somewhere, but I never noticed him before, but I saw him this time, which was cool. And of course, it's got the best zombie effects, I would say, in a movie.
Like, period?
I would say so. I mean, it's Tom Savini at the top of his game. And of course, after that, all the Romero movies start incorporating a bunch of dumb CGI blood splatters, and they just turn really stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like the music a lot, although I question whether it's really appropriate for the movie, because I never liked it until I listened to it on its own. But yeah, definitely a really good zombie movie for anybody who hasn't seen it. And you don't need to see the first two to know what's going on. It's just zombies have taken over the earth, and that's the movie. I watched The Fly, but not the Cronenberg version, the version from 1958.
Oh, the Vincent Price one?
Yeah, which I definitely prefer over the Cronenberg version. I like the Cronenberg version, but to me it feels like it's a lot more about the body horror stuff, which is cool. But I like the old one a lot more in terms of the story and the way things play out. And I really like the mystery aspect of the whole thing, because when the movie starts, you don't know what's happened. You know the guy is dead, but you don't know why. You don't know why the movie's called The Fly. I guess maybe you would if you had seen the poster back in the day. But if you show it to somebody blind and they don't know what it's about, I feel like it would be way more effective, and I think it's really good. Definitely one of my favorite 50s sci-fi movies.
Yeah, I really like it too.
Yeah, and even the effects of The Fly itself. I usually think of, I don't know if it's Return of the Fly or Curse of the Fly, but there's one of them where you can see the guy very blatantly adjusting his fly mask all the time and stumbling around and stuff because he can't see what he's doing. But in this movie, it looks really good, and the actor does a really good job with it without, making it look like he can't tell what he's doing. So, yeah, it's definitely a really good movie. Also, it's in color, which I always forget because the sequels are in black and white.
Was it originally in color?
Yes. That's one of those Mandela effect kind of things where people seem to remember that it's in black and white, but it's actually in color.
Oh, I remember it as being in black and white. Interesting.
And of course, Vincent Price is always good.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that it doesn't have, I guess it does have a happy ending at the end, which feels kind of stupid, but I like the fact that it's unexpected the way, I mean, I guess when the movie starts, you already know that the scientist is dead, so it's not a spoiler, but I would have expected for a movie of the time period that they would find a way to save him, given that he's not a bad guy. Even once he turns into the Fly, he's not a bad guy. Things just don't work out for him and keep getting worse, and then he has to die. There's not really a villain in the movie. And all the teleporting stuff is really cool, too. I think it's a really effective movie all around. I watched The Dark Tower, but not the Stephen King one, and not the Michael Moriarty one. This was a movie from 1943 about a circus that is getting ready to go out of business. They're not making money anymore when this mysterious foreigner comes along who has hypnotic powers and kind of uses his powers to make their acts better and causes the circus to start to become successful again. But he falls in love with kind of the main girl who's in love with this other guy, and it turns into a whole thing. And it played out pretty predictably. I wouldn't really recommend this movie. There was nothing special about it. But the reasons I watched it were it was one of the earliest Herbert Lom movies, and I really like Herbert Lom. I know him best as Captain Nemo in Mysterious Island, but he's been in a bunch of movies. He was the doctor in The Dead Zone. He had a small role in Spartacus. He was in Asylum with Peter Cushing. He's in a whole bunch of things, and he's always cool. And he was cool in this movie. He was definitely the standout. But the movie played out pretty predictably. And then it was also edited by Terrence Fisher, who directed most of the good Hammer movies. So I was intrigued enough to check it out, but it was just okay. I watched 2 Val Lewton, Boris Karloff movies, both from 1945, which I had never seen before. Isle of the Dead and The Body Snatcher. Isle of the Dead was about a group of people that are stranded on an island while a plague is going around. And they don't want to get back to the mainland because they don't want to carry the plague with them. And there's a war going on, and Boris Karloff is a Greek officer in the war, and he doesn't want to, make things go bad by taking it back to his men. And some of the people that are living on the island, it's a Greek island, they think that one of the people is secretly a vampiric creature that is basically killing everybody and draining their life force. And over the course of the movie, more and more people start to maybe believe that. And I thought it was kind of funny, given the era that we live in right now, that they keep talking about how people need to keep their distance and not come into contact with each other to avoid spreading things. But of course, they keep saying, oh shit, I wasn't supposed to touch you, but I already did. And they keep saying, oh, we shouldn't be congregating in groups. And then they go talk to each other face to face, literally inches away from each other. And then they all keep dying, but they keep doing the same thing. And the movie overall was disappointing, given that it was Val Lewton. I thought it was going to be a lot better than it was, because he did things like Cat People, which is awesome. Overall, the movie was just okay. There was one cool, maybe 5-minute stretch toward the end where it really does seem like maybe something supernatural is going on, because through the whole movie, you don't actually know. You're kind of questioning. But then at the end, it all kind of simplifies again and just kind of ends. It was kind of disappointing by the end, but it definitely wasn't bad. The Body Snatcher was based on a Robert Louis Stevenson story, which I also read. It's basically based on the Burke and Hare stuff from back in the day when people that were studying medicine needed corpses to practice on. So they started paying people to bring them corpses, and they found that it was easier to kill people and bring them fresh bodies. So that's what they started doing. And that's basically what happens in the movie and in the story. And the movie followed the story semi-closely. It was enough that, I don't know, it felt faithful enough, even though they did change a lot of things. But it ended up being disappointing to me too. It was directed by Robert Wise, who had previously directed Curse of the Cat People, and would go on to direct things like The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Haunting, The Sand Pebbles, which is a movie that I really like, and then things like The Sound of Music and West Side Story. So he has a very varied career, but he's usually really good. And this movie was okay, but it felt pretty by the numbers. It felt pretty much like what you would expect. The short story ended in a way that didn't make any sense. It seemed to throw in possibly a supernatural aspect at the very end, but without explaining anything, and it left me feeling very unsatisfied. The movie takes that idea and injects it in a way that actually makes sense, and was definitely a lot more effective. Without spoiling things, it felt a lot like an Edgar Allan Poe kind of thing, like a Telltale Heart kind of situation, where they start kind of feeling guilt, and it leads them to possibly imagine that things are happening that aren't actually happening. And that was pretty cool, but the movie just ended up being okay. As far as what I read a book called The Genome Odyssey by Ewan Angus Ashley. This was a nonfiction book.
So why read it?
Dr. Ashley works with an organization that sequences people's genomes to try to figure out what their problems are when they're dealing with medical issues that people can't diagnose. He specifically focuses on heart issues. So a lot of the book was just cases that they've dealt with, and it felt like watching a medical drama or something, especially like House, where they're trying to figure out what the cause of the problem is and then how to solve it. And I mean, it was good. He knows what he's talking about because he actually works in the field. I don't have any particular interest in the medical side of things, but I am interested in genetics, which is why I read it. And compared to other genetics-related books that I've read, in terms of looking toward the future, this book was 100% optimistic. Well, first of all, it talked about how sequencing people's genomes has become so easy and so cheap compared to how it used to be. I mean, I remember back when the Human Genome Project was a huge thing, and it cost billions of dollars and never actually finished. They never actually ended up sequencing somebody's entire genome. But now you can do that in a day for like not that much money. And it's incredibly useful for finding not just problems that people are already dealing with, but the potential for problems that might happen in the future based on mutations they might have in their genome. And the book was all about how in the future that's going to become more and more of a thing, where the more people whose genomes we have sequenced, the easier it is to tell when something is abnormal and to figure out what problems it might cause and how to prevent things from happening. It was definitely a book that made me feel optimistic about the future of the medical field when it comes to stuff like that, but without going into all the negatives of genetic engineering that books like that usually deal with how it's going to change society in negative ways. My only real problem with it was that it was his first book. It felt like he was kind of falling back on things that he learned in high school about writing, where it's kind of like, oh, you have to have an introductory paragraph, and then you do your kind of main stuff, and then you have a closing paragraph. And every section of the book felt like that, to the point where I started skimming the last couple paragraphs of each section because it was all stuff I had already read. The kind of stuff that you're taught in high school about how to write papers is not how you should actually write books. And I wish they wouldn't teach that because it's not very helpful. But I guess I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in anything like that. I read Quest of the Spider, which was the third Doc Savage novel from 1933. For anybody who doesn't know, Doc Savage was a pulp magazine where every month you would get an entire novel in an issue about Doc Savage, who was kind of like a superhero. He had this band of adventurers that he would hang out with, and they would fight crime and try to solve sometimes weird mysteries and stuff. Kind of like Johnny Quest. Nobody really has superpowers, although in Doc Savage's case, he's pretty much the strongest person in the world. He can jump 20 feet straight up. They call him the Man of Bronze because he literally looks like he's made out of bronze. But they never give any explanations, as far as I know, as to why he has these abilities. They basically just say that his dad trained him since he was like 2 to be physically superior and mentally superior to everybody on the planet, and it just worked. And now he can jump really far and pick people up with one hand and throw them across like a building, and just, I don't know. It's very over the top when it comes to the action stuff. It's very much the epitome of a pulp adventure story where even his sidekicks are the next strongest people in the world, basically. And they, you can have an entire crowd of people fighting them, and they're just going to tear through them and throw them all over the place and just leave mangled bodies all over the place, which is funny. Most of these stories were all written by a guy named Lester Dent. And I feel like sometimes he's kind of laughing at them as he's writing them and kind of trying to see how over the top he can get, especially with the descriptions of some of his friends, like Monk, who they call Monk because he looks like an ape. They're always described the same way, where his arms are 6 inches longer than his legs or something like that, and they dangle down to the sides of his body, and he's all covered in fur, and just, it's goofy, but they're very enjoyable. The sense of adventure and the creativity and everything really keeps you invested. This was not one of the better ones, in my opinion. This was kind of voodoo themed. They go down to Louisiana, and even just the main plot was about a bad guy who calls himself the Gray Spider, who wants to take out different lumber companies or something for some reason. I don't even know if they even said why. I don't know if he was trying to just take over himself or what, but he's causing all these companies to go out of business. So it's kind of disappointing like that. There was a sequence where Doc Savage puts on a crocodile or an alligator costume and makes himself look like an alligator in order to infiltrate the bad guy camp out in the swamp, which was pretty funny.
I actually did that in Metal Gear Solid 3.
So that gives you an idea of how goofy it gets. But they're enjoyable. I don't know. I really like these stories. I own a whole bunch of those reprints of those Doc Savage stories. And then Doc Savage also was a huge influence on Superman. You've got the Man of Bronze and then the Man of Steel. Doc Savage's first name is Clark. Doc Savage has a secret lab up in the Arctic that he refers to as the Fortress of Solitude, which was actually introduced into the Superman comics by a writer that wrote Doc Savage stories. And Superman originally couldn't fly. He was just really strong and could jump really far and stuff like that, which is basically what Doc Savage can do. So the similarities are very obvious. And just like the early Superman stories, Doc Savage is more aggressive than what you think of as Superman now. So yeah, maybe this is also a plug for the early Superman comics because they're really cool. I read Essential Avengers Volume 4, which covers the end of the 60s into the early 70s, all written by Roy Thomas, illustrated by John and Sal Buscema, and a little bit by Neil Adams. The main selling point of this particular volume was the Kree-Skrull War, which was a 9-issue storyline, And at the time, it was kind of the most epic thing they had done, where you had all the current Avengers, you had all the Avengers that didn't really show up that often, like Thor, Iron Man, and Captain America, who were kind of doing their own thing at the time. And then you had the Fantastic Four, you had the Inhumans, you had the Kree Empire, the Skrull Empire, you had Captain Marvel. You had pretty much everybody involved. You had Nick Fury there, and it just covers so much ground. I can see why people look back on it and say that was really awesome. But when you actually read it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You can kind of tell that Roy Thomas is making things up as he goes along. There are even some plot points that never get picked up until literally years later because they forgot about them. But it was interesting to me because back when I edited the Halloween episode of Buffy...
What a shameless plug.
No, it'll make sense. When I said something about somebody dressing up as a giant... I think I said a giant... something somebody would wear for like a joke that would be purposely stupid or something. The only thing I can think of is like a giant or something, but I'm not going to say that. I used a picture of Neil Adams for that. And because he's just a dick in real life. And I thought it would be funny. I knew nobody was, I didn't even tell you that that's what I used, but for me it was funny to use a picture of Neil Adams. In looking for a picture, I came across a series of arguments that he had with Roy Thomas. Somebody had posted something about the Kree-Skrull War, and Neil Adams commented talking about where he came up with the ideas and everything. And people were like, I'm pretty sure you didn't write that. I'm pretty sure Roy Thomas wrote that. And he came back and said, no, it was all my ideas. I did everything. Which is pretty typical for modern Neil Adams. He's a huge asshole and takes credit for a lot of things that he didn't do. And it's very blatantly a Roy Thomas story. It has all the Roy Thomas hallmarks. You've got Golden Age characters coming in. You've got all these concepts that were originally created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby being further developed by Roy Thomas, which is what he was basically doing on the Avengers the entire time he was on it. It very much feels like a Roy Thomas story. And eventually, after so many people kept calling Neil Adams out, Roy Thomas finally responded himself and said, yeah, Neil Adams' version of the story doesn't make any sense, and here's why. And he laid out all these reasons, and it made sense. And they kind of went back and forth, and Neil Adams was like, no, these are my ideas. Like, I went back and saw Fantastic Four #2 and said, hey, what happened to those Skrulls that got turned into cows at the end? Because Fantastic Four #2 ends with the way they defeat the Skrulls. Instead of sending them back into space, Reed Richards hypnotizes them into shapeshifting into cows and making them think that they are cows, and then just letting them wander out in a field.
That's awesome.
It's awesome in a way, yes, in a very Silver Age way. But by the time you get to the early 70s, you start saying, wait a minute, that's a little weird. And they kind of said, what happened to those cows?
It reminds me of that Marvel cartoon where Magneto got tricked into letting himself be led to jail because Reed Richards convinces him he's lost his powers because he made a wooden gun look like metal.
Yeah, so Magneto's powers wouldn't work on it. Yeah, I remember that.
And he's like, oh, you foiled me again. I guess I'll go to jail now. Even after he knows.
Yeah. I mean, that also, feels very Silver Agey. So anyway, I guess I would say check him out. I will also add that Tom Palmer is the inker on a lot of these issues, and I think he's a big part of why Neil Adams was as good as he was. Because when you see his inking on Neil Adams, and you see his inking on John Buscema, it makes it look kind of similar. It's clear that his polishing of everything is a big part of what brought it up to such a high level. And when you see Neil Adams inking himself, it doesn't look as good, especially nowadays where he doesn't seem to be putting as much effort into it. He's all about talking himself up now instead of actually doing good work. So yeah, I don't like Neil Adams is the moral of the story.
It's a nice 20-minute rant to get that out.
Yeah. Since a lot of what I read is short stories and I jump around between different books, instead of waiting until I finish a collection, which can be years, I'm going to just talk about certain things that stick out when I get to them. And I only have one of those today, a novel called The Boats of the Glen Carrig, which was written by William Hope Hodgson. All of Hodgson's fiction is collected across 5 paperback volumes, which I highly recommend. And this is the first novel in the first volume. Each volume collects one novel and a bunch of themed short stories, so this is all nautical themed stuff in this first volume. And The Boats of the Glen Carrig was the one that really stood out. I would call it a horror adventure survival story. It's about these 2 lifeboats that are out in the ocean after their ship goes down, and they come across this island. It's a really shallow island that's barely rises up out of the water, so everything is mud. They travel up this river. Eventually, the land kind of starts rising, and there are these weird plants on it that they can't identify. And they find this other ship up there that's been stranded up there for who knows how long. Everybody's dead. But they take shelter on it at night, and they keep hearing these weird noises. and it sounds almost like creatures hunting each other or something, but they can't see anything from inside the ship, and they don't want to go out at night if they don't know what it is. So during the day, they go out to explore, and I'm not going to spoil what they find, but there's some really weird stuff. Definitely some of the weirdest stuff that I've encountered in any kind of story. And I like that they don't explain what any of it even is. You kind of have to make up your own conclusions, I guess. There's one point where a character says, "Oh, I know what's happening now. I know what this is that we're dealing with." But then they never actually explain it to any of the other characters. They never say what their conclusions are, which I thought was funny. I'm not going to say more about that part of it because it was really weird, very nightmarish. It really felt like you're dreaming while you're reading it because of how weird everything is. That was the first third of the book. The other 2/3, they find another island because they end up leaving that place because it's so weird. They find this other island that's surrounded by seaweed. This is out in the Sargasso Sea, which back in the day, people used to think that ships would get trapped in the seaweed, which we now know doesn't really happen, but it led to a lot of cool stories back in the day. And the seaweed is filled with giant crabs and giant octopuses that are just hiding beneath the surface. And they find all these other ships that are trapped in there, and everybody's dead again, and they're just overrun with these giant creatures and stuff. And they find this other island, and the story becomes them trying to survive on the island while also finding out that one of the ships that's out in the seaweed is still inhabited, and it becomes them trying to figure out how to get to the ship and how to free it from the weed and use it to escape, while also dealing with the fact that there is another threat on the island that is of a higher intelligence than the crabs and stuff, a closer to human intelligence, which I'm not going to spoil what that is because, again, this is a story that I would highly recommend to everybody. I'm pretty sure it's in the public domain, so you can get it for free online. It's really, really cool, and Hodgson knew his stuff when it came to being out on the ocean, so all of the non-horror stuff feels very realistic. And you could have taken out all those elements, all the monsters and stuff, and it would just be a survival story, and I think it would still work. But when you stick those things in there, it makes it feel that much more effective. It feels very surreal when you're dealing with all these realistic situations, and then a giant octopus pops out and starts killing everybody. It was really cool, and it gets very action-y at times, too. There were some surprisingly large-scale battles between all the people and the other threats that they're dealing with. And it was really, really cool. I would love to see, well, I guess nowadays if they did a movie like this, it would have been stupid, but maybe back in the day a movie could have been cool. There was a Hammer movie that came out in 1968 called The Lost Continent that was based on a book by Dennis Wheatley, which was basically ripped off of these Hodgson stories. It's definitely the closest thing to one of those stories in movie form. And I saw that movie when I was a kid, and it had a huge impact on me. I thought it was really awesome. When I saw it as an adult, it was pretty disappointing because some of the effects are really dumb. But I guess I would still recommend that movie too. It has a really cool atmosphere. After seeing the movie and then reading the story, it makes all the seaweed stuff a lot cooler, I think. But the story itself is just awesome. I definitely highly recommend it. And the rest of the stories that I read so far from that first volume feel like the same thing. They feel like just short story versions of sections of the novel, and reading them after the novel made them disappointing because it felt like something I had already read, but in short story form and with much less development. But the novel itself was really, really cool. So yeah, definitely check it out. And I've been talking enough, so that's all I read this month. So what did you check out this month?
I watched The Blackcoat's Daughter, which was recommended by somebody in the comments.
Yeah, I've heard nothing but good things about it. How was it?
It's from 2015. It was really good. It was a very slow burn, but I really liked it. It had a lot of red herrings that felt like it legitimately could have gone in those directions. That's what made them so good. And there's a big twist, I guess, that I'm not sure if it's supposed to feel like, oh, because I kind of saw it coming before it was revealed. But I really liked the ending. Very satisfying. And it had Emma Roberts, who I usually don't like because of the characters that she plays. It didn't really have a lot of characters. James Remar was one of them.
All right. All of a sudden, it's at the top of my list.
He was good, though. I would recommend it, for sure.
Okay.
I watched Prometheus from 2012. I saw this in theaters, and it was dumb.
Yeah, that's the last time I saw it, so I don't remember it super well.
It is a competently made movie. The people making the movie knew what they were doing. They knew how to make a good movie. Unfortunately, it's this movie. I think trying to say it's an Alien prequel, but not really.
Yeah. I know the original screenwriter wrote it as an Alien prequel, and then they said, you know what, maybe we shouldn't do that. This is the producers talking. So they hired Damon Lindelof, who always seems to come in and screw things up, to change it just enough that it wasn't a direct prequel.
But it was.
Yeah, the things that the original screenwriter said that they changed made it sound like it would have been much better if they had left it alone, and it would have made actual sense. And instead, we got what we got.
The characters were really stupid and just not well written.
Yeah, actually, I guess those things might have been the same.
Every possible thing they could do that would make their situation worse, they do. Hey, we're in this weird alien environment. Let's all take off our helmets. Hey, in this weird alien environment, there's this alien snake thing. I'm gonna go touch it. Just shit like that. And it's frustrating because looking at the mechanics of everything, they could have made a good movie. Running away from the falling ship that is as thin as a pencil, but instead of just moving to the side, they just keep running the length of it twice. And their pool table, all of the balls are silver. They don't have stripes or numbers or anything on them to determine what the hell's going on.
That's when you put it into challenge mode.
Having twists like Guy Pearce actually being alive doesn't contribute anything.
And being on the ship the whole time. I remember his makeup being really bad too.
They show a close-up of his foot. It was weird. And then at that point, he's like, oh, stand me up. So he stands up, and to the main character, he gives this big dumb speech, and then he sits back down. He doesn't go anywhere after he stands up.
It was to help expand his diaphragm when he's talking.
Well, that was that. I like The Thing from 1982. It's one of my favorite movies.
Okay, I would agree.
I watched the 2011 version of The Thing, which I had not seen before because I didn't want to, because it looked stupid.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, it was pretty dumb. To its credit, I will say for the first 30 minutes, it felt like if it had not turned into basically The Thing again, it could have been a really cool movie. At about 35 minutes, that's when it breaks out of the ice and becomes a CGI dumbfest. But before that, I was pleasantly surprised. I thought, if this wasn't The Thing, it actually could have turned into something cool.
Well, let me ask you, if they had kept the original practical effects, would it have been good? Was it the CGI that ruined it, or would it still have not been good?
No, I don't think it would have been good still. It would have been better. But it just kept turning into the same scene over and over again. Like in the 1982 one, the characters all have personalities. They all interact with each other. This one did not feel like that. I think part of it was because there were a ton of people in the movie, and they didn't have defined personalities outside of maybe two of them. The main character and her supposed foil, who wasn't really, but then he became The Thing, so it doesn't really matter. I know when they were making it, they said, we want to make this a prequel because the 82 version is perfect and there's no way to improve it. Yet they called it The Thing. They didn't even give it a prequel type title. And apparently that mindset is no longer true because they're going to remake The Thing again.
Of course.
And I know the studio thinks if we just can get John Carpenter's name in there somewhere as a consultant or just get a few pictures of him on set, that will make it the greatest thing ever. And people will go watch it, which unfortunately is true for some people. They will see John Carpenter's name attached to it and say, all right, I'm going.
But this time they won't just do the effects in CGI. All the people will be CGI. So it'll be even better.
The ultimate would be seeing a CG version of Tom Savini walking around, even though he didn't even work on that movie.
Yeah.
They did go further into the aliens' origins in this one.
I mean, to me, it seems like one of those things where they said, what questions would people have about the first one? But there were no questions that needed answers. Those things didn't matter.
And when they were making the movie, there was some disagreements on how to actually do stuff or what should actually be revealed. At one point, there was going to be a part where the original pilot of the craft was still in the craft and just dead. And The Thing had just taken over the ship.
So they basically stole that from Alien.
And they had actually built a body of the pilot to be dead or something. But when they decided to not do that, They overlaid this really, really bad CGI Tetris looking thing over the pilot. It looks like it came straight out of a PS3 video game. It looks really bad. So it must have happened in the last 10 minutes before the movie was released to theaters.
I'm pretty sure that is what happened. I'm pretty sure the CGI people, since that wasn't what they were supposed to originally do, they barely had any time to work on it.
I didn't mind the main character's acting. I thought she was probably the only good part of the whole thing. The thing effects were just so over the top and CGI laden. It was very frustrating. Like when the first person reveals that they're the thing, it was so bad. I could not stop laughing. This month was a very Seinfeld month. Seinfeld got put on Netflix. Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld got $500 million to have their show put on Netflix, which is ridiculous. And it's wild because back in the day when TV broadcasts were the thing, there was no streaming, there wasn't anything like that. A half-hour episode of a TV show was actually 22 minutes because you had so many commercials in there. So these episodes fly by so fast. So I managed to knock out all 9 seasons in this month, and it didn't even take that long.
Jeez.
And while the show is ridiculous and silly, I think the writing is competent. And the fact that even in season 9, you still have very memorable episodes that are good speaks a lot for the show. I know you don't like the show at all.
Yeah, I've been thinking about giving it a chance more than I have before. You say it's on Netflix, maybe I'll watch a couple episodes.
I think once you get to season 3, that's really where it starts to understand what it is. And the first season is only 5 episodes anyway. And it has kind of an Always Sunny type thing where the characters are not good people. They don't learn lessons. They don't have these big arcs where they learn about themselves. From the very beginning to the very end, they're not good people. Everyone they interact with, it blows up in their face. It's pretty good, which is part of why I like Always Sunny too. And watch Jumanji, the good one, the only one worth watching.
You're talking about the cartoon, of course.
I like that movie. And I was thinking, after watching The Thing, the CG for that is there, but it's very much in a sense of only when we can't do it practically. There's one point where there's a lion, and I was paying very close attention to how many shots were practical and how many shots were CG. And it was legit. Only the things they couldn't do were CG. For example, when it bounced down this huge spiral staircase. But every other shot was practical, which I thought was cool. Those monkeys look like shit, though.
Yeah, I remember the monkeys.
I think that's really the only part. And the stampede doesn't look too great. But the rest of it's cool. I watched Under Siege from 1992, that Steven Seagal movie, which I've never seen before, but I watched it for some reason, where he is a cook on a Navy ship, and it gets taken over by Tommy Lee Jones and Gary Busey, and then he has to Steven Seagal his way to win. It was idiotic. I think it's wild that Tommy Lee Jones lists Two-Face as one of his least favorite roles because it was so stupid. But then I watched this movie, and I'm like, why didn't you say that? Yeah, because he's been in other movies where I'm like, really? This is worse than freaking Two-Face. Like No Country for Old Men. What was that? I'm just kidding. That movie's awesome. Steven Seagal is an idiot. He can't act. He can't really do anything. And it's written like a 12-year-old would write it. But he's the 12-year-old. And then the good guy just makes out with the girl, and he just shoves his tongue down her throat and licks her teeth, and it's awesome. You know, like a 12-year-old would write.
Yeah, just saying that sounds so gross.
Gary Busey, I think it was during his decline, his whole drug thing and that accident he had, and you can see it.
I didn't realize that was that long ago.
But it was not a good movie. It was not an entertaining movie. It wasn't even worth watching to say, oh, check this movie out. It's so dumb.
Did Steven Seagal do his own stunt work at least? His own action scenes?
I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to that. He probably didn't even do his own cooking. I watched Scary Movie 4 from 2006. I think I have only seen the first Scary Movie, and that was when it came out. And that was when I was a dumb kid. It was exactly what I expected. Unbelievably stupid and not funny. But going for the funny of, hey, do you recognize this pop culture reference?
Yeah.
Now they're going to puke all over someone else. Ha ha ha. After I watched Jumanji, I watched Zathura, a space adventure, which was the quote-unquote sequel from 2005, so it's 10 years later. And it was not good.
Really? I remember thinking it was okay.
Jumanji had the kids, but also Robin Williams and Bonnie Hunt. So even though the kids are doing things, you have the adult people to fall back on for their humor and their dialogue and conversations. You have other characters. You got David Allen Greer as the cop. You got Bebe Neuwirth as the aunt. You've got Jonathan Hyde running around shooting people. So there's more going on. Robin Williams' character has a backstory. It's all tied in together. This movie had two brothers who just argue with each other. That's it. And at the end, they learn to not do that. That's their growth path. It's very frustrating and annoying to just hear them keep bitching at each other over and over and over again. Their parents are divorced, but that doesn't really come up. At least the kids in Jumanji, their parents had died, they were living with their aunt, the one had a compulsive lying problem, the one didn't like to talk a lot. They had growth potential. These two kids were just annoying. I think part of the problem is the one was so young, and the other one was Josh Hutcherson. And even as a kid, it was very clear he was trying to act.
I mean, I probably saw it not that long after it came out, so that would have been a long time ago.
And they're both books by the same guy.
Yeah, the Polar Express guy.
But the Jumanji book and the Jumanji movie are very different. The book is not very long. It's just a kid's picture book. It doesn't have all of that character stuff in it, which I thought was very impressive that the movie turned out the way it did. And could truly say, based on the book, instead of saying, this is the book. The people making that movie had a good grasp of the movie that they wanted to make. Whereas this one, they're pulling from the same kind of source material, but I think they were just banking on it being the sequel to Jumanji. So I was not really impressed. Some of the effects were cool, but it felt much more like a kid's movie, whereas Jumanji felt like something you could enjoy with your kids.
Mm-hmm.
I watched one episode of The Movies That Made Us. That thing where they go into the backstory of all these classic movies.
Yeah, I've been meaning to check that out.
I don't like the way it's presented because it's trying to be really clever and quippy, but the content is in there. I only watched the Aliens one because I was interested to see if there was stuff I didn't know already from, reading up about the making of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And James Remar was supposed to be Hicks, right?
Yeah.
You know why he wasn't Hicks?
He got sick.
No. He got into drugs and was arrested and then fired.
They probably made up a story then.
Yeah, they actually interview him and he talks about it, about how after that happened, that's what made him get clean. They don't talk to James Cameron, but they talk to a lot of the effects people and they talk to some of the actors, including Sigourney Weaver, which was good. But there wasn't too much that I didn't already know. But I guess if you were interested in learning more about it, it would be worth watching. I really liked all the effects people they were talking to and how all that worked out. And it just reinforced that James Cameron is a perfectionist jerk.
Which I find kind of ironic, given that things like Avatar is just all CGI, so...
They did interview Roger Corman, too, and Gale Ann Hurd.
Did Roger Corman talk about what he did to rip it off? Carnosaur 2 is the plot of Aliens, but with dinosaurs instead of aliens. Yeah, instead of fighting the Queen in a power loader, they fight a T-Rex with a forklift.
Are you being serious?
Yes. And there's a scene where the helicopter's going to take off, but it turns out there's a raptor on it, so it crashes and explodes.
That's all I watched this month. Seinfeld took up most of it. I read The Essential Spider-Woman Volume 2, which is from the early 80s, and it started off pretty slow.
Who's writing those?
Chris Claremont takes over after a while, but it passes between quite a few people. I went into it thinking, well, Spider-Woman's probably just trying to capitalize on Spider-Man, but they are very different characters, which I was pleased to find out. It started off with her and her buddy, and they were, detectives for hire pretty much. But he was a dick and actually became a villain at one point, and then she was on her own. And it actually got a lot better after that, once she could kind of do what she wanted to do. So she can glide, she can't fly, so she needs wind currents. She doesn't have webbing, but she can shoot venom blasts out, which shock and stun people. And she can cling to stuff.
She's supposed to be able to make people either fear her or be attracted to her. Maybe they developed that more later, I don't know.
Yeah, it didn't really come up too much in this.
I know she's gone through periods where she kind of loses powers and gains powers and stuff like that.
It was cool how much they focused on her everyday life. I felt like Peter Parker's like, oh man, I gotta weigh these two things. My Spider-Man persona and Peter Parker persona, there's a lot going on, which I like. But in this one, it doesn't really feel like she's attached at the hip to Spider-Woman. She'll do it when she needs to, but she has no problem just going to a movie. Her villains were interesting. There was one that comes to mind, Daddy Longlegs. So it's this dude who's a dancer, but he's too short. And he won't get hired because he's too short. So he breaks into Giant Man's lab and starts chugging all of the chemicals, saying, one of these must be the right one. And he gets really, really tall and lanky. So he's just got really long legs and really long arms. And he is super graceful because he's a dancer, right? So he goes back to the stage and everyone starts laughing at him because he looks like a really tall dude. So then he becomes a villain. Which kind of reminded me of Jamie Foxx in that one Spider-Man movie where he's like, Spider-Man didn't remember my name. And that's when he became evil. So Spider-Woman's going after him and she shoots a venom blast. But he's so graceful that he just dodges out of the way because he's a dancer. The issues were very entertaining, apart from the beginning ones. I thought it was overall pretty good, and I didn't expect to like it very much. I played Billion Road, which came out in 2018, which I was hoping would be a kind of spiritual successor to Fortune Street. Unfortunately, Billion Road was not a successor to that, but it kind of became its own thing. There's way too much chance and luck involved, and if you're down and out, there is no way you can come back. And there's a ton of math going on behind the scenes. Even when you understand what's going on, you just have to look at the places and say, am I in first or not? And it has this monster mechanic where you have monsters trailing you and they have abilities and stuff, which was cool. But again, it relies too much on luck and chance. I played Legend of Mana, the remake. So it originally came out in 99 for PS1, but they re-released it on like a bunch of stuff now. It's still weird. It's still good. It was during that time when companies felt more free to experiment with the traditional game models. It didn't matter as much if it was profitable or not. It was more, we have the money, let's just try and do stuff. So it turned out to be pretty cool, very unique. I never took the time as a kid to figure out the best way to set everything up. And I was really surprised that for all these remakes, they completely rearranged all of the music. And they did it really well. And all of the backgrounds and sprite work meshes really well together, which I appreciated so much because I can't stand when they remake a game and the art styles do not match at all.
Yeah.
Like, for example, they'll take the character sprites but make them into really janky looking Flash models, but then all the backgrounds will still be pixel art. And the last thing I played was Metroid Dread, which came out this year, which was awesome. There hasn't been a 2D Metroid game since Game Boy Advance. It's been a long time. And this one did not disappoint. Like most Metroid games, it's not very long comparatively to other games, but it doesn't have to be. There's so much content packed into it. I felt like it did the Metroid series justice. Now I'm just waiting for Metroid Prime 4. I mean, come on. And it's called Dread because it's supposed to give you the sense of dread. It does handle the atmosphere very well. I don't know if I felt dread. Metroid unease. It was cool though, and I've already done it a few times and been playing through trying to get all the different unlockable stuff. Have you ever played a Metroid game before?
Not all that much. I played a little bit of Prime, and I think probably Super Metroid or something. I couldn't figure out how to progress.
Something like Super Metroid does have less hand-holding. This one felt a little more modern. I think part of what helped it was so much more of the map is labeled, so you still have to explore and find stuff, but instead of the map just being one big polygon that's one solid color, it has all of the different pieces, parts of things that are in that room. And if you don't know what it is, it's just a bunch of question marks, which is good. But if you do know what it is, you can say, oh, everything's color-coded and I know I can use what I just got. So I wouldn't call it hand-holding, but I would say it is more informative, which works in its favor.
Yeah, I think some games struggle with the difference between not making something too simplistic, but then also not making it needlessly frustrating. There's a difference between a challenge and figuring things out and then just being frustrating.
Yeah, and I never felt like this was frustrating. And that's all I got for this month.
So thanks for listening to us ramble on for another hour and however long this ends up being.
I think you went on way longer than I did.
I have strong feelings about Neil Adams.
Yeah, if he ever watches this video.
Hey, I didn't even talk about his expanding Earth theory or whatever. Oh man, don't get me started on that. According to him, if it were not for Neil Adams, comics would not exist. I'm pretty sure that was a direct quote.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's not to say that he didn't do good stuff. I mean, he was very important, not just in terms of what he did as an artist, but in terms of what he did behind the scenes, which is why it makes it that much more frustrating that he takes credit for things that he didn't do because he doesn't even need to. He did a lot. All he's got to do is talk about what he actually did, which I would actually like to hear about. But when he starts throwing in things that blatantly are not true, or things that, with his Expanding Earth stuff, that he just sticks in when you want to hear about comics, and he's trying to tell you about his ideas about physics when he doesn't know anything about physics in the first place, it's really just annoying.
Yeah, it turns him into Neil Sadams. I think that's a good way to end this. Come back next month.